लेकिन कल एक एपिसोड शूट होने वाला है, वीकेंड में हम लोग रिलीज करेंगे। जितने भी लोगों की फलाना कोलैब की है, अगर कल एपिसोड सक्सेसफुली हो जाता है, so I can't believe this is actually happening. Today we are joined with the cricket's most amazing writer, the ultimate game changer, and the slayer of giants, the undisputed goat of all goats. That is one and only Jarrod Kimber. I can't actually believe this is happening. Jarrod, they say that cricket is.
I can't believe that introduction, man. I'll take that.
I have written a more, it was more comical, but my friend told me, no, just you need to tone down a bit. But you know what they say, that cricket is all about pulling off heist. But I feel that we are the pirates today, leading the charge. So once again, thank you so much, Legend, for gracing our channel, and forgive us in advance if we seem a bit all over the place. Your presence has us all in awe, man. So thanks a ton. And I'll just introduce you, myself, Vibhor, and this is my friend, a very good friend, Vivek, and we both are cricketing buddies. We actually met on cricket ground. We play tennis cricket in India. So today I would like to talk to you about the batting evolution, because you have written a fantastic book, that is The Art of Batting. I thought I might try to extract something interesting from you. So for start, I thought, okay, let's talk about the batting evolution. I'll just start brief you, and I'll ask you a few questions, and I hope you can you can just enlighten us. So once again, welcome everybody to today's episode, and we are diving into something that is at the very heart of cricket, that is batting. And not just batting as numbers on scoreboard, right? But batting as an art form. Every era of cricket has like redefined what great batting looks like, and that what makes this game fascinating. So Jarrod, like, the opening question or the opening thing I would like to discuss is the art of batting. In your book, The Art of Batting, you have oftenly said that batting is more than just runs. So how do you define batting as an art form, and do you think batting is the best lens to study the evolution of cricket itself, not just the batting itself?
No, I think there's always a push and pull. So I think you'd be wrong if you just looked at batting and you didn't really understand, the way that the bowling works as well, right? Like, that sort of that combination of it. But yeah, I think you can tell a pretty good tale in the history of cricket by looking at just the batting averages at any one stage, the average per wicket. Right. I think they tell you a very good story about where the game is at any one time, of, whether it's being dominated by one thing or another, whether there are external forces at play, whether there's been a law change, whether there's been conditions changes. You could see it all the way through the history of the game. And so, within that, I think you have the ability to tell much bigger stories about evolution and technology and professionalism, all these different things.
That's really great, and my friend will take over from here.
So, Jared, I will like to start from the very beginning. So, in the 19th century, we had batsmen like W.G. Grace, who were shaping batting at that point of time. So, at that time, the pitches were primitive. Batting was about survival rather than scoring runs. And yet, people like Grace built reputations that are still echoing today. So, I would like to start from him. So, do you about W.G. Grace? He is often described as the first modern superstar. So do you see him that way, or was he product of uncovered pitches, unclear laws? What is your take on that?
Oh, he was absolute freak of nature, W.G. Grace. Like, I think when you're talking about him, you have to be honest and say he's a child of privilege. He spent there might have been more talented cricketers than W.G. Grace who were off being chimney sweeps, right, in London, and they didn't get the, they didn't give the access to cricket fields and cricket coaches and to all these other things. But he was a genius, and he was also very lucky that, the way he saw the game worked completely perfectly for the period he was in. So before him, people would either lean on their front foot and then play from the front foot, or lean on their back foot and play from their back foot. And so his ability to be like, well, no, when the ball's in the air, that's when I want to make my decision, is what changes batting, right? And what's fascinating about that is he's doing that in what, 1860s, early on, and people don't catch up to him till like the 1890s. So
Yeah.
now some of that is because we don't have cameras, and it would have been very hard to send a WhatsApp back in those days and all that sort of stuff. But even within that, you would have expected other people to look at him and go, oh, okay, no, that's what we should be doing. This is the guy that's perfected it. Let's do what he does. And no one really does. So I think that tells you that this is not just a normal talented player, right? This is, maybe one of the most naturally gifted players who had ever existed. But if we were to watch him today, and there is some footage available of him if you want to have a look, he does not look like a great batter, right? In the way that if you watch Bradman, look at the way that Bradman moves, you can understand, oh, okay, the bowling might have been slower and there are other conditions, but look at the way Bradman moves. He's in position to play these shots before the ball's even anywhere near him, right? Whereas if you look at Grace, and he's still a first-class cricketer at this point, but if you look at him when he's a first-class cricketer and the camera's on him, he doesn't look like the sort of player that we're talking about here. So I think he was really, I think he was a brilliant athlete, and I think that's very underrated. Like, he was a hurdler, and he played football as well. So it wasn't as if we remember him as the big old fat man he became, but we forget that at one stage he was probably one of the better cricket athletes as well. Yeah. And so all of those things came together, and he became just this incredible player who pioneered a method which we still use today, right? Like, when it comes down to it, everything he came up with still works today for any cricketer playing.
So similarly, like WG Grace, there was a very famous batter, Victor Trumper, who is like almost spoken like a mythical creature. So what are your thoughts about Trumper's contribution in those days?
Yeah, so Grace, as has moved the game forward. So footwork becomes a thing, but still, the majority of bowling at that stage was at the stumps because the pitches weren't very good. And people didn't really hit to the leg side unless the bowling was down the leg side. So it wasn't that you didn't have fielders on the leg side, because obviously you would have fielders there. But people wouldn't drag the ball over there. So if the ball was bowled down the leg side, you would score on the leg side. And Ranji is obviously the one that really opens that up with the leg glance. But even the other players, quite often when the ball goes to the leg side, it's a miss hit, or the bowler's just bowled a half tracker down the leg side and there's nowhere else to hit it. Trumper comes along and he basically goes, well, there's 6 fielders on this side and there's 3 fielders on this side. So why am I hitting the ball on the offside? And it's, again, just a simple moment of genius, right? Where he just thinks to himself, I can do this. And remember, the pitches are starting to get better, so he doesn't have to worry about the terrible pitches. Although he was a great player on terrible pitches, hilariously, as well, in his particular case. Yeah. But he doesn't have to worry about that. He can now trust the ball a lot more than the players in Grace's era could. And so he just takes the ball from outside the off stump and he flicks it to leg. That is revolutionary, right? Because now you hit the ball where you want to hit it. And up until that point, it wasn't even seen as like a proper cricket thing to do, because cricket was being run by rich amateurs like Grace, and they would play the game as it was played. And so Trumper's just like, no, I'm going to hit the ball where I need to hit it. And so, within the space of 30 to 40 years, basically the 3 men in Grace, Ranji, and Trumper, and there were plenty of others who aren't legends, but other players who were really important as well. But they essentially invent what is batting today, right? In those 3 different things, they open up both sides of the field and forward play and backward play. And yeah, cricket has evolved beyond that, but those 3 elements still exist today.
So that's what. So Jarrod, so moving forward, I just wanted to ask you one more question on this topic. So like, what did batting really look like before it became modern? So was it more of a technique game, or was it just sheer courage on those terrible pitches?
Well, you got to remember, a lot of those terrible pitches, the ball wasn't bouncing very high because they weren't very hard. So it wasn't as if everyone's getting hit in the face. Because I think if that had happened, I think if we hadn't have fixed the pitches, helmets probably come in, because bowlers would have naturally got faster as techniques got better, right? And if you match that with the bad pitches, we would have ended up with helmets. The fact that we don't have helmets, I think it tells you it's not you got hit a lot, but you got hit a lot on the legs, right? And maybe on the lower chest and the hands and those sorts of areas. So there is an element of courage there. Remember that Grace plays in pads, but Grace is just at the period where pads are coming in. So the real courageous period was just before Grace, when people were playing with these big, heavy bats. Sometimes the bats were like 4 pounds. So like, Yeah, so if you think of Chris Gale's bat is probably and Clive Lloyd, I think they're both 3 pounds. They're less than 3.5 pounds, and they're incredible athletes. And so people used to use 4-pound bats, right? I think that tells you how much different the bats were, which tells you how much different the game was at that point. And the original bats look like hockey sticks, right? And that's because the ball's running along the ground at that point. So there's, you definitely have an element of that. So I think by the sort of the Grace Ranji period, and Ranji's sort of at more of a crossover than Grace is, I think you're still getting underarm bowling and you're still getting sidearm bowling, and the pitches aren't very good. But it's the courage is more: will you play a shot, knowing that if you play a shot, the next ball could hit a bit of, cow turd on the wicket and roll along the ground and bowl you, right? So the courage wasn't as physical. Whereas I think playing cricket in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, you had to be prepared that someone's going to whack you on the kneecap with a cricket ball, and all of us have fielded. We know what that's like. It's horrendous. So I do think there was that, but yeah, it was much more. I would say it was probably a lot more offside play and a lot of heavy bats playing big drives or attempted drives.
It was more of the front foot. Even I remember, just on that note, I remember your article, cricket's greatest bastard, on Cricket Monthly, and I remember you have very in detail you have written about the Grace one. But I would love to continue on this, that is technical and fundamentals. I would love to discuss about the techniques. So when we talk about technique, that is grip, stance, footworks, there is so much evolution I have seen, like just by seeing the highlights of the older eras. There used to be a high front elbow, that is like a cricketing gospel that every coaching or every coach must have taught their batters. Yet the modern batters like Steve Smith, in fact my favorite, Shiv Narayan Chandra Paul, have just completely ditched that rule book, and they still dominated. So Jarrod, I would like to ask you, in your research for the art of batting, your book, what technical elements stood the test of time and which have evolved the most?
Yeah. So just on the technical thing. So basically what happens is the MCC quite early on start releasing something called the MCC coaching handbook. I think that's what it's called. And it stops getting printed about 20 or 30 years ago, basically because no one outside of like Sachin Tendulkar and a couple of other women's players are playing like it anymore, right? Like it's completely out of date. And so it gets passed around, and every coaching book is the same thing. As you said, this high front elbow. That makes sense if you're facing someone about 75 miles an hour on a pitch that has very consistent bounce, right? And you're specifically trying to stop the ball from swinging or seaming. It basically makes sense if you're playing English club cricket, right? It doesn't make sense if you're facing Les Hall. And so that technique was always going to fall down once you had taller, faster bowlers coming through. Not to mention that, the way that people play spin in the subcontinent was very different. Because traditionally, of course, the ball spun a lot in the Western places as well because of the damper wickets and the uncovered wickets. Right. That disappears. So it doesn't really make sense, that handbook anymore. And so what happens is you instead of having a Grace or a Ranji or a Trumper, everyone sort of becomes a Grace or a Ranji or a Trumper, right? In that everyone comes up with a method that they need to survive at that level. So when you talk about the things that you need to do, it's very rare to find a player who doesn't have a still head, right? So if you have a look at that, it is very, very rare to find a player who doesn't have a still head. And the majority of players who are great play the ball very late, right? There are exceptions to that. Viv Richards, Kevin Peterson, there are others, right? But the majority of players play it very, very late. And we know, again, that is so you can get the ball under your eyes. I would almost argue that everything else is up for grabs, right? Okay. So we would have always heard that you need a straight backlift. Well, Steve Smith doesn't have a straight backlift, right? We would always hear that you need to be very still before the ball is being bowled. Well, you just said Shiv Narayan Chandra Paul is not particularly still. There's a whole bit in our book, and I think this was written in the 1920s about I don't actually think he was a scientist. No, he wasn't a scientist, sorry. He might have been a dentist or something, but he's someone who understood scientific method. And he is talking about the way eyes work and the two-eyed stance compared to the one-eye stance. So since we're on YouTube, a two-eyed stance is obviously when I'm facing more like straight at you like this with a slightly open stance. And the more one-eyed stance is when I'm cocking my shoulder over and my left shoulder is aiming at you, right? And he was talking about how, there is reasons why the one-eye stance makes more sense than the two-eye stance and all this sort of stuff. So these conversations are not new. But we now know that that, again, doesn't matter, right? That is just a small thing. Now there are elements of, if you have a very open stance, you generally struggle with the ball more outside of stump. And that's because your left foot is starting on leg stump or even outside leg stump, and it takes longer to get it outside of stump, right? But it also allows you to play the ball off your stumps easier because you're not closing up your technique. So there is no one technique that will work for everyone. And, you know, I coach a lot of kids now, and sort of from under 7s up to under 13s, under 15s occasionally as well. And I'm trying to find the technique that makes sense for them, right? Not the technique that is correct. So my son is quite a tall, upright kind of batter. And some of his coaches have tried to get him to become forward and lungy. And I was like, that won't fit him. He doesn't have the balance for that. And it's not a natural position for him to get into. Whereas he bats more like a Moeen Ali or a Kevin Peterson. Very tall and very upright. And he'll take a small step and then play the shot through there. And he's balanced. And because he's balanced and his head still, he's absolutely fine. Whereas some of the other kids I've taught, complete opposite. You do want them to get as far forward as possible because, you know, they have other issues within their batting. So that's kind of what you're looking for, is that the right player at the right time that matches their technique. But if you read the chapter in The Art of Batting on this, I don't say that there is a technique that works. I literally go the other way and say, no, outside of keeping your head still and maybe playing the ball later, I'm not sure there is a grip that works. I'm not sure there is a backlift that works. I'm not sure there is footwork that works for everyone. I don't know if you took Rahul Dravid and you tried to make him play like Kevin Peterson, he would be anywhere near as good, right? But they're both two of the 50 greatest batters of all time. So you have to be smart here and go, okay, this works for this player and this works for this player.
Exactly. I remember when I was a kid and when I watched Chandrapal for the first time, I thought he's a tailender or a bowler who doesn't know to bat. Because even in my wildest dream, I can't even think someone could stand like that. But he was a great genius, and I was so wrong in my childhood. But on that note, comparing the past and the present, I would like to ask you that with time the protective gears evolved and the bats and the every technology evolved. So how much has equipment shaped the technique and strategy? And do modern flat pitches and gear actually masks the technical weaknesses compared to older eras?
No, I think I've watched probably more old cricket footage than anyone who isn't old, right? And I am old, but I'm
100%.
not that old. You know, I'm only in my 40s, so you know, my cricket knowledge comes from 1990 onwards, really, if we're being honest. But I've watched there's heaps of shit techniques. This idea that like old guys had great techniques, like Bradman isn't even a technically correct player, right? Like, so
Right.
it's a kind of a nonsense. You do get players like Trumper and Gavaskar who are just incredible technical geniuses, right? Sachin Tendulkar is another one, right? But you get plenty of other players like Lara's backlift is too long, is too wide, and too high, I should say. So it's very normal to have those kinds of things. Your technique or your run scoring is matched to the era that you are in, right? So I've got a friend of mine who's a really smart guy in cricket, and he's like, but Jarrod, if you took a modern player and you put them back in the 1950s, they'd get caught in the ring all the time because they can't trust the bats to get the ball over the top. And I'm like, yeah, of course you would. If you took Roger Federer and you made him play tomorrow in a tournament with a wooden tennis racket, he'd be shit, right? It's not that
Right.
Roger Federer isn't any good. It's that he wouldn't understand how to use the technical stuff. And the same as if, you know, and I've done a video about this before. If you took Don Bradman, right, at the age of, let's say, 23 or even 27, 28 when he's at his peak, right, and you brought him to now, he'd be terrible. But he wouldn't be terrible for the reasons that people think he would be terrible. He'd be terrible for the fact that he very rarely had to go up against tall bowlers who could bowl over 70 miles an hour, because tall bowlers used to not bowl particularly fast back in his era, right? He'd be terrible because he didn't have to face bouncers all that much. He'd be terrible because the spinners were far slower than they are now, right? So there are multiple reasons why Don Bradman would struggle in this modern era, right? So when you say mask, that's not the best way of looking at it. There have been plenty of eras where we've had flat pitches before, right? It's not like, you know, and we don't even have flat pitches now. What are people talking about? The global bowling averages in Test cricket are lower now than they have been almost for any other era throughout the history of the game. So, no, it's just a different technical way of playing, right? And if you're coming through now, you're going to be much more likely to hit boundaries. Some of that is the bats. Some of that is the physical strength. Some of that is just white ball cricket, right? You're much more likely to try and hit boundaries. You're also much more likely to try and get off strike. In the old days, they would try and block the ball for hours on end, right? Whereas now modern players are like, why would I want to give Vernon Philander 24 deliveries at me? He's going to get me out. My best chance is to find a way to get off strike against Vernon Philander. And if I can get off strike, he can't bowl to me. And if we keep rotating strike, he has to come up with 2 different plans for each one of us, and he won't be as good at it. So there are plenty of things that are much more advanced, right? Like when it comes to modern batters compared to older ones, but the techniques have changed. But Don Bradman never faced a 90-mile-an-hour bowler in his entire career, right? It's impossible for an international player not to face a 90-mile-an-hour bowler now. And I don't mean it's like you might get away with it. It is literally impossible to play 20 international games and not face one person who's going to bowl at 90 miles an hour to you at one stage, right? So the technique is very different than Len Hutton. Len Hutton can get on the front foot with a high front elbow over and over again because he didn't have to face 90 miles an hour. Even to go back to not that long ago, Sachin Tendulkar's, 10, 15 years ago, his technique would be different now than it was when he played because he had to face the odd 90-mile-an-hour bowler, right? Whereas now he'd be coming through, and the vast majority of the bowlers he'd be facing in domestic cricket and everything else would be at 80, 85, right? And then international cricket would be 87, 92, even 95 miles an hour. Rather than when he played, you had Brett Lee, right? You had Shoaib Akhtar. You had Alan Donald. You had Sean Tate. Look at the paces of modern bowlers compared to that era of bowlers. There are some bowlers from that era that have higher top-end speeds, but look at the second and third bowlers on the team. Some of those guys were bowling at 78 miles an hour. If you bowl 78 miles an hour now, Twitter explodes, right? Where's Ollie Robinson? What's Ollie Robinson's test average? Not even playing anymore, right? So in those days, that's what Glenn McGrath was bowling at for most of his career. So your technique should be different now. And if it's not, you're probably not going to succeed. As I said before, if you try and play with an old-fashioned technique against new-fashioned bowling, you're going to go out. For instance, again, Rahul Dravid is talking to Kevin Peterson. We reprint the email in the book. I asked Rahul Dravid if we could do that. And he's talking about the fact that the way he learned to play spin was pre-DRS. So if you hear all these uncles, right, of being like, oh, they don't use their feet enough, or they don't do a big forward press. And it's like, yeah, because they don't use their feet because the spinners are quicker, which Rahul Dravid admits in the book. And they can't do the big forward press because umpires give them out LBW now. So if you play like Sunil Gavaskar, you'd fucking go out. And he's the best player of spin that probably ever existed in cricket.
That's so. So just continuing on that bowling, please Vivek, go for it. I think that's the perfect segue.
So, of course, I am in awe with what Jarrod has spoken till now, but I will continue with facing different bowling eras. So, generally, batting is never static. It evolves in response to how bowling has developed. So, from classical defense in the early 20th century to facing ferocious pace, like you told in later half of the 20th century, to today's high octane ball by ball matchups where a lot of data analysis have come in. So how do you think like the batters overcome these bowling revolutions through the decade?
Yeah, I think essentially sometimes we just forget that batters are just professionals, right? Like even in the amateur era. But you are someone who's working on a craft, on a skill. We call it the craft of cricket's greatest run scorers, right? But that's not an accident that word's in there. And so if you were an accountant, right, and you had 7 or 8 years of being an accountant, and there's a big change in your industry, most accountants are probably going to change with that, right? Because they're going to have to.
Makes sense.
Right? And so batters are no different. They are experts at evolving with different situations. Now, there are players, I'm actually working on a piece about this at the moment, which is, it's kind of about Virat Kohli, but it's about Virat Kohli, Kevin Peterson, and Shane Watson, if we're being honest. Those are 3 players who had big technical changes that they had to make late in their career because cricket changed. And it was maybe just too late for them to be able to do that physically, if you know what I mean by that stage. They either too set in their ways or they didn't have the ability to just change everything that they did, right? That does happen on occasion. And it's probably more common now than ever before because every 3 or 4 years, there's a new revolution happening. Like it was DRS, and then it was the lengths that people bowled, then it was the line that people bowled, then it was the wobble ball. Like, so every 3 or 4 years, you have to be so on it. And if you're not on it, you can just drop off, right? And and so it's very, very different. But that's what professionals do, right? Like in any industry, that's what you're trying to do. And sometimes you can't, right? And I've seen this I've seen this with writers who are very, very good at writing exactly what they did, and then the industry changes and they just have to go off and get another job. And we see that occasionally with batters. But the vast majority see these changes coming incrementally and they get involved with it. And they do change their career and they do change, where they're going with all these sorts of things. And because of that, they handle it. So it's no different for a batter, right? It's exactly the same. And I remember trying to talk to someone. I forget who this was, but it was an international batter, like a famous player who you would know. And I was saying, how did you start handling the wobble ball? And he said, to be honest, I was probably playing it for an age before I realized that's what it was. He goes, but in my mind, I'd already kind of like adjusted to it, right? And he said, it's almost like I realized I had adjusted to the wobble ball after I had adjusted to the wobble ball. And and you guys are right to laugh, but that's kind of how change happens, right? It's the boiling frog story, isn't it? All you're really doing is changing the temperature on the frog until and eventually the frog gets boiled, right? It doesn't realize that these things are changing around it. But it's also the frog in the water is probably changing its body a little bit at a certain point to handle it until it can no longer handle it anymore, which comes back to the Shane Watson, Kevin Peterson, Virat Kohli thing of some frogs get boiled, whereas actually what happens more often than not is you learn how not to get boiled, right? That's really how these things go. Your body or your mind adapts to these things. I had another fairly well-known international cricketer tell me I was going too much about the wobble ball. Stop talking about the wobble ball. It's not a thing, blah, blah, blah. And I showed him all the footage, right, that I had accumulated at that point. And he's like, I didn't even notice that. Like, it wasn't, like, I didn't realize that was happening. That's why you're going on about it. And I said, yeah. And I said, Stuart Broad has called himself a wobble ball bowler, right? Like, let's not be silly here, right? Like, this is literally something that the bowlers are thinking about. And so when you're an international batter, you are just naturally doing that. There's another one. Why don't batters use their feet against spin as much, right? And it's because you don't have the time to come down the wicket anymore. So I'm sure you could find an international player who early in their career was using their feet to spin a lot, and later in their career Well, no. I was going to say, and then later in their career almost stop entirely. Okay. So Pujara keeps going, but him and Michael Clark are on a different level to everyone else. But I'm talking about a normal batter. It might be someone like Joe Root, who I'm sure if you look early in his career, he was probably using his feet more, and then later in his career, he's probably sweeping more, right? But I think if you had that conversation with him, he wouldn't know, right? The best one I have for you is Rahul Dravid. Again, in the book, he talks about this. He's reading, I've forgotten the name of the book. What's it called? Hitting Against the Spin. The Nathan Lehman, Ben Jones book. He's reading that book, and there's information about his batting in that book that he did not know, right? And that just shows you that's it's not what they're doing. And I've had people do that with my writing sometimes, right? Like someone will say to me, I love the way that you do this. I had a friend who said to me, you're such an expert on narrative. Like and this guy was like a guy who was a screenwriter. And I went, am I? And he's like, yes, that's your thing, is this, your ability to see narrative in any sort of thing. I went, okay. Yeah. I didn't know. Like, and I think that sometimes all you're trying to do is survive as a professional, and it's someone else who comes to you and goes, I can't believe you do that. And you went, okay.
So it makes sense. So I just thought, why not just we were talking about Don Bradman, and obviously I've never seen him bat, and I have just so basically I don't think so we can talk about cricket, at least we can talk about batting without talking about the freak Don Bradman. An average of 99.94. Statistically, no one in any sport has probably outstripped their peers by such a huge margin, right? So if I'll personally say, if this wasn't a recorded historical data, I would consider this as some sort of a mythical legends. I'm telling you, when I was a kid, someone told me it's a 9. I thought it's someone's like creation or something. So Jarrod, do we over romanticize Bradman, or was his batting genuinely incomparable?
No, it was like nothing we've ever seen before, really. And I would doubt that we'll ever see anything like that again. He averages
So
what is George Headley's the second best batter of his era, and he averages 60, 61. Herbert Sutcliffe's about the same, right? And you're talking about someone who's averaging 40 runs more than the second best batters of his era. Like, how do you even mentally work that out? And people always bring up Wilt Chamberlain, the NBA player, and I'm like, well, Wilt Chamberlain averaged 50 points in 1 year. But there have been players who've averaged 40 points quite regularly, right? If Wilt Chamberlain averaged 60 points every single year, he would be Bradman. And he averaged 50 points 1 year. So, statistically, from that perspective, we've never had anyone that much better than the second best player in their era, right? From a sport where we can do counting stats. It might be different from, obviously there's the great Pakistani squash legends, and there's been some snooker players, and Rod Laver as a tennis player, but we're talking purely as counting stats and averages and those sorts of records. We haven't had anyone like Bradman. So there are problems with his record, not problems as in he's not very good, but we only ever saw him play in 2 countries, right? Test cricket, first class cricket, he played in other countries and was still very good, but he only ever played Test cricket in 2 countries. He didn't have to face his own attack, right? Which was at times the best in the world. Having said that, he absolutely slaughtered those same bowlers when he played against them in first class cricket. And Bill O'Reilly, who was probably by far the best bowler in the world during his era, hated bowling to Bradman. Hated Bradman in general, but hated bowling to him. So we know, right, that there's no issue from that perspective. Didn't play on wet wickets all that well. I think I talk about that in the book, that actually probably proves that he was sent from the future a little bit, because his game was almost set up for the next generation rather than the generation he was in. And could be rattled by the short ball, but still in a bodyline series managed to average 50 against it, right? Which is
with a good strike rate.
Yeah, so if that's the worst that you've done, it's still, and you can break down that bodyline one a little bit, because I think one of the games they didn't bowl bodyline that much, and that's when he made the 100. So there are still arguments within that. But I did this the other day on one of my podcasts, and we're trying to sort of put this together of, if you look at all the different skills that you would look at as elite batting skills, he's probably a 9 or a 10 on almost every single one of them, right? And maybe an 8 on a couple of them. Right? Maybe a 5 on wet wickets if you want to be unfriendly. And I'd have to have a look at what the overall average was on wet wickets. But I don't think he was terrible on wet wickets. He's probably like a 7 on wet wickets, maybe, if I'm being fair on that. And so you have a player who was elite in every single skill of batting. And that just doesn't come along very often, right? That's not a normal thing that you see in a player. And on top of that, just the psychological way that he looked at cricket was very different to everyone else. I think it was. Not only was he a professional in an era when, professionalism was just sort of coming through and everything else, he was like a hyper professional, right? Like, he was like the professional's professional in that period. And he had this incredible method it was almost impossible to get him out, right? There wasn't any sort of a weak spot. So, I think it's in Tim Wigmore's book in Test Cricket. He talked to a lot of the guys who bowled to Sachin. And they talk about the wobble ball weirdly in the 90s. And that was one of the things they tried to do to Sachin was, if you could take the ball from outside off stump back into him, they were like, hey, there's a way of getting him out, right? Go back and listen to the bowlers who bowled at Bradman. They don't even come up with an idea of how to get him out. They don't even have a plan of what you could possibly do on your best day to get him out. He just was that next level that we have never seen before. And as you can make an argument, maybe no sport's ever seen before.
So if do you really think that it's his work ethics that actually made him so different, and he outscored all his peers by such a huge margin? And if I have to ask you, do you think he's the ultimate batting outlier?
Oh, he's definitely the ultimate batting liner. No, I don't think it's his work ethic. I think, but to go back, it's everything, right? It's the fact that he was very quick on his feet, right? So it's a small thing, but you know, I was talking to someone who worked in basketball about this recently. He was asking me about cricket athleticism. He's like, one thing I don't understand is, as someone who's watched a bit of cricket, is like what the athleticism is. And I said, so in basketball, your first step is really important, right? So my son's not the quickest kid in the world, right, over 100 meters, but his first step is lightning. And so trying to keep him in front of you on a basketball court is so hard because once he gets past your hip, he's there, right? Inzamam al-Haq, who's going to call him an athlete? I went back and watched him. Have a look at his first step. Because part of it is premeditation. So if you can be fast as well, right? And Bradman was incredibly fast. So Bradman is reading the ball before it comes down to him and is incredibly fast to move towards it, right? That combination of those two things means that he's in a position well before any other player is. And he can play shots that other people can't play because he's already worked out what the delivery is. And he's almost already programmed what is the best shot to be able to play to that ball before anyone else in that situation has managed to do it, right? And so you know, and then that's one skill we're talking about. He has that ability for pretty much every high level cricket skill imaginable. Right, he has it for all of them. That ability to be like, I'm going to do this for this ball. I'm going to do this for this ball. I'm going to pick the right option every time. So Sachin Tendulkar is a perfect example of a player who picks the right option every time, right? But Brian Lara didn't, right? Garfield Sobers didn't. Lots of players don't pick the right option every time, right? So Bradman is picking the right option every single time. He's got more time and space than anyone else. His ability to get forward and back means that he can turn the ball into what he wants. He can turn any ball from off stump, even outside off stump, to the leg side anytime he wants to be able to do that. The minute you bowl in the channel outside off stump, he will be able to pierce the gap. So Sachin Tendulkar is a brilliant player, but teams will tell you that you have the ability with Sachin Tendulkar to set a field that he will respect, right? You won't stop him, but he will respect it. I heard that with some other great players as well. Whereas Brian Lara, that doesn't matter where the fielders are because Brian Lara is seeing the ball so early and has the ability to open or close his wrists in such a way that he will just hit the ball past the fielders all the time. So Sachin Tendulkar's ability to pick the best shot to play for each ball with Brian Lara's ability to hit the ball into the gaps, right? That's what you're starting to combine with someone like Don Bradman. And as I said before, it's like he's in the 99th percentile in some of these skills as well. So and then also he was the best player of spin in the world and the best player of pace in the world at the same time, right? And you could throw in other bits of that too. He was the best player of slow spin and the best player of fast spin. And that was a thing in his day. Like spinners were vastly different speeds to each other. He was the best player of the moving ball, right? And he was still one of the best players of fast bowling, even if that wasn't his main skill. He's probably in the top 5 of that as well. So those players, you go through the history of the game. When have we ever had someone who's had that many skills? He's also probably the best runner between wickets in his era.
What?
So
see, you know what?
You just keep going, right? Like, you know, like Brian, just to take it back to Brian Lara and Sachin Tendulkar, who I both have in the top 5 of all time. Brian Lara was very good at getting off strike, but not a brilliant runner between wickets. Sachin Tendulkar, pretty good runner between wickets, but we wouldn't have him in the top 10 of all time of running between the wickets. And he certainly wouldn't have been thought of as in the top 3 or 4 of his era. Like he wasn't Steve Waugh or someone, you know, or Ricky Ponting or someone like that, right? Or Jonty Rhodes. And so again, you're like, every way you look at Don Bradman, he's at that top level of you can't set a field to him. He's not going to play the shot that you want him to play, but he is going to pick the exact right shot to play. He's never going to lose patience, but he's also going to score at such a regular rate that he's going to put pressure back on your team, right? There isn't a kind of bowling that is going to dismiss him. There isn't a secret, you know, I remember Graham Pollock, who, you know, was obviously, had it not been for apartheid, probably goes down as one of the top 10 greatest players of all, batters of all time, and still has a great record even without that, right? Ian Chappell said to me, with Graham Pollock, you could bowl bouncers and you could kind of slow him down a little bit. You could stop him, right? You could change the tempo of Graham Pollock and it would make him do something different. Again, you can't do that to Don Bradman. He's going to either fend you off and find singles, or he's going to hook or pull you, right? So there isn't like that Len Hutton, incredible player, Len Hutton, one of the most undervalued batters in the history of the game. You can slow Len Hutton down to about a strike rate of 30 to 35. So yeah, you can't get him out, but he's putting no pressure back on you, right? He's just
Right.
holding up his end. Bradman, I think his strike rate's around 50 to 55, which for his era is quite quick.
Yep.
So he's putting pressure back on you again. So it's not as if, you can do anything to him. You bowl wide of off stump and he smashes you through extra cover to backward point. Right, and I say backward point to third man with him. He sort of had the ability to play quite straight, but also very, very fine. So where do you put the fielders, right? You almost, if you have a look at the amount of times he picks the gap, a bit like Kane Williamson, to backward point or to third man, you almost need a third in for him the whole time. But the minute you put that fielder in, he starts smashing the ball through covers.
Yep.
So there isn't, and he can hit straight. I would say that hitting straight was probably the thing he did the least, weirdly. But if the minute you start putting the fielder squarer, he will just hit you straight. So it's so hard to sort of put him in a bottle and sort of stop him in any single direction. And that it's the combination of all the elite skills. There are players who are probably, and Sachin's a really good example of this, who have a lot of the different skills that Bradman had, right? But he doesn't have the exact same skills that Bradman had, or as many of the skills as Bradman had. And so once you do that, where do you bowl to him? How do you bowl to him? What's your fielding plan? Well, it looked like teams have no idea, right? And so maybe it would have been more interesting if people had kept bowling bounces to him. And I don't think the West Indies ever tried bodyline to him. I think that would have been fascinating because, but I don't think it would have changed his average all that much, mate, right? And you hear things like, oh, he never had to go to Asia. He would have averaged 100 in Asia in that period because he was playing incredible spin bowlers on uncovered wickets and quite often wet wickets, right? He didn't have an issue against spin. This isn't like Ricky Ponting, right? Ricky Ponting doesn't know how to play spin until he goes to Asia, right? He just doesn't,
Right.
because Australian wickets are completely different. In Bradman's era, they were playing great spinners. Have a look. Australia's best bowlers were Grimmett and O'Reilly. They didn't even have a great seam bowling lineup. Hugh Tayfield, right? Like all these incredible spinners were around in Australia, South Africa, West Indies. Like I think South Africa's best bowler was Cyril Vincent. He's a left arm finger spinner, I think, as well at that point. Most of the best bowlers in the world were spinners pre-World War II. Different conversation for a different day. But there is this whole idea of, if he'd gone to Asia. No. He played on Manning wickets, which spun a lot, right? We know that from first-class cricket, and he still scored runs. So anywhere he would have gone, he would have been able to do that. But he doesn't have the same stress testing that Sachin Tendulkar does, right? Just because the era is different. And Jack Hobbs is the same, and W.G. Grace is the same. They just don't have the same level of stress testing. And someone pointed this out when we were researching the book about Barry Richards, of like, a lot of people like say Barry Richards is one of the greatest batters of all time, but they don't have the two VJs in that, right? And all of those have shorter careers. I think you could say with Barry Richards that he conquered Australia, South Africa, and England. But you could also say those are roughly the same. And if we had a player coming through who was really good in Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and India, we would still say, but could they have done it on Asian wickets, and could they have done it in other situations, which is very, very fair, right? And I think you have to weigh all of those things up, which is one reason I think that Sachin gets such a bump, because he was so great everywhere, right? And I think that's why he gets that. Bradman isn't going to get that. But there are times during Sachin's career where you could make very good claims that he wasn't actually the best batter in the world, right? There is no time from his second test match until his last test match that you could say that Bradman is not the best batter in the world. You could say that Headley is not that far behind him. You could say that Sutcliffe and Hutton and Hammond are incredible. You can't say they're better than Bradman, and you can't even say they're on the same level as Bradman. You can't even say that they're particularly close to Bradman. CLR James, tried to do that over and over again. And I think Headley's incredible and very underrated. He ain't Bradman.
In fact, you know what? I won't be surprised if there is a news in the future that Bradman was built by the Australian scientist in some sort of a bunker or something, because that's crazy. But you were talking about so many great batsmen. That is Viv Richards. You talk about Brian Lara. You talked about the god, we call it him, Sachin Tendulkar, and then we have a lot of modern batters like Dravid. Then we have Steve Smith and Virat Kohli. So these are the outliers of their era, right? The Sachin, the Virat Kohli. I have, if you, you know what, if you have to pinpoint one common trait among outliers across the era, what would it be? Like one common trait.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. I think there's. Do you know what a shibboleth is?
No.
So shibboleth is
I've not.
it's a Jewish term.
Okay.
I'm not sure if it's a Yiddish word or a Hebrew word, but it's a Jewish term, and it basically means that it's a way back in the old days when Jewish people were being persecuted, that there was things that they could do that would allow them, when they were walking around hiding their ethnicity or their religion, where it would allow people to other Jewish people to realize that they were Jewish, right? So an outsider would never know. But when they met someone, there was something that they could do, a shibboleth that they could do that would allow people to understand that they were Jewish, right? Which
It's a
allowed them to.
secret code.
Yeah, oh, it's almost like, is it the Freemasons have their secret handshake? It's kind of like
Okay,
that, right?
yeah.
And so there are shibboleths that cricketers have, right? That are passed down from generation to generation. This is how you bat, this is how you play, this is what cricket is. And so if we were to interview a cricketer, they wouldn't even be able to pick these up because they're so deeply
Involved.
subconscious, right?
Yeah.
The outliers, for whatever reason, just grow different. And
They're just built different.
and whatever reason, like what made Grace decide to bat forward and back, right?
Exactly.
So why did Steve Smith decide to? Australia didn't even want to pick Steve Smith as a batter, right? Ricky Ponting said he'd never be able to bat in the top 6. And what made him pick the bat up with this weird tennis grip and continue with it, even when everyone told him it was wrong, right? And so you occasionally get an A.B. de Villiers, a Martin Crowe,
Yeah.
a Len Hutton, who is just kind of, they are the evolution of what batting is at that moment, if you know what I mean. So they take all the knowledge from beforehand and they put it together perfectly and then they use it and they're great, right?
Right.
But you then get Viv Richards and Brian Lara and Gufford Sobers and Don Bradman and Steve Smith. I could go on and on. George Headley. These Javed Miandad, who don't do that. They go, nah, I'm going to do this.
Yep.
Right? And, I asked Brian Lara for the book. I said, because I'm a young kid, and I had a big backlift. I'm a young kid. I was a young kid who played cricket with a big backlift. I'm no longer a young kid. That needs to be clear. And I remember the minute I got to the higher level of cricket, everyone just went, you can't have a big backlift, mate. And I went, why not? It's it's how I've made all my runs. It's how I bat. And they went, yeah, at this level, everyone's just going to bowl full and straight to you. And we know that you like to drive, but you're going to miss a couple, right? And, you're susceptible to the Yorker. And they explained it. They were right. So I said to Brian Lara, did anyone ever tell you that your backlift was too high? And he said, no, I was making too many runs. Now, I don't believe that. I don't believe that no one ever told him that his backlift was too high, because they definitely did. But the point being is, when you believe in your method so much, and Steve Smith's a really good example of this, you just don't listen to those other things, right? So you become an outlier without meaning to, right? And some of these people are outliers normally. I would say that, Steve Smith is, on some kind of spectrums, within his life of whatever they may be. Like he's, and Kevin Peterson has his issues, right? And you can go through, there's probably a few players, and Javed Miandad's probably another guy that's a really interesting guy if, you sit these other guys down. So maybe it's just that they were already kind of outsiders and weirdos and didn't quite fit in. Maybe it's the Brian Lara thing of, well, they were smashing people all their life and it worked, so they kept doing it. I don't know. But there is an element of that, and if you can get the right outlier skills at the right time that fit with the era that you're playing in, right? Suddenly that we see an explosion, right? And you can go through. So Hobbs is the perfect example, of someone who everyone was batting for bad pitches, right? Because cricket was all about bad pitches. And Hobbs comes along and he bats for good pitches, right? And because he bats for good pitches and not bad pitches, he capitalizes on runs that other players can't even find, right? Everyone else is still worried about the stumps, worried about being bold and LBW and all these different things. And Jack Hobbs is like, no, actually, the ball's coming through pretty nice. So I'm just going to play normally, right? And so he basically is the first, I would say he's the first modern batter, right? And on the back of him, we get Hammond and Sutcliffe and Headley and Bradman, right? They all come on the back end of Hobbs. And that's what, and all those guys, I would say, again, are modern batters in that they trust the pitch, they play their normal shots. Yeah, they have to adapt to excess swing or excess seam or low bounce, whatever else, but they trust that the more or less the ball's going to come up. Whereas I think before Hobbs, even guys like Trumper and Clem Hill, who were fantastic, were still kind of attacking quite a lot because they were like, eventually the ball's going to have our name on it, right? Like eventually one's going to get through us because that's what's happened all the way through our life. So again, what makes Hobbs the guy who does that? I don't know if I have a great answer for that, right? And, you know, one of the other things that we kind of, you know, I was lucky enough to talk to, you know, Rahul Dravid and Kumar Sangakkara and these sorts of guys, and they couldn't really answer it either, right? Of like how they became them. You know, like, you know, Rahul Dravid talking about Ricky Ponting is, one day I'm just going to have to say, sorry, Rahul, you just have to do a podcast because it's, the information you have on Ricky Ponting is too great. But he was basically talking through the whole thing of like, and you know, Rahul Dravid, he really understands cricket like around the world. And he's like, Jarrod, you would have grown up not playing with helmets probably. And I was like, yeah, I didn't wear a helmet when I first started. Then helmets came in a little bit. But then in Australia, it was seen as like not masculine to wear a helmet. So you would wear a helmet when you first came to the crease if you were a junior. And then you would take it off as like a sign of, I don't need a helmet anymore, right? And he said, so, you know, you would have been in a situation where you would have been hit in the head and other people, you know, would have been hit in the head, you know, and that sort of stuff. And I was like, yeah, of course. Like that was a normal thing in club cricket in Australia because there's more bounce, right? It's the one place the helmet should have been invented, right? Originally, because there's just more bounce. It's not even about the pace of the bowls. It's just the bounce. And he was like, think about all the people in Launceston who are playing cricket, who are really good at cricket, who get hit in the head when they're kids and they just stop playing cricket. Or they get hit in the head and they flinch and they can never play the short ball again. Or they get hit in the head once, or they see someone get hit in the head once and they start to think in the back of their head, I don't know about this, right? How is Ponting the one that comes through that system? How is Ponting the one who goes, yeah, I'm just going to keep doing it? And if you think about modern cricket, Ponting is the last major international player who faces top level fast bowling without a helmet.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
And he's probably one of the last great players of fast bowling. And it's because he grew up when you had to hit it. You didn't have a choice. Right? And you could see him facing Curtly Ambrose and is it Muhammad Amir, I think? Is it Muhammad Amir?
Mohammad Shami.
Sammy, yeah.
Sami, Pakistani.
Yeah. So we see him facing Curtly Ambrose, Muhammad Sami, and other fast bowlers, right? You know, without a helmet at times. Because he grew up without that and it was normal to him, right? And so what Dravid was saying is, how do you recreate that with his son? Impossible. His son might have, let's just say his son was a complete clone of his. You can't create that. Recreate that. And the perfect example that, and as I said, this is a long conversation with Rahul Dravid, but when he said it, it just opened me up so much was, and I'd never thought about this before, but we've never had two great batters from the same family. We've had very good batters from the same family. We've had like one great batter and one decent batter from the same family, but we've never had two great batters from the one family. And, you know, when I started to think about it, I was like, think about how much time and effort Sachin Tendulkar put into Arjun Tendulkar. Who can hold a bat? No one's saying the guy can't bat, right? Like, I think he's made a first-class 100 and everything. But he's not a batter. At best, he's a bowler who can hold the bat a little bit. Maybe one day he becomes a decent number 6 or number 7. Like, I don't know how he's going to develop as a player. But you just can't develop. And Arjun Tendulkar had so many more advantages than Sachin Tendulkar did. I was there when Arjun was being coached by like former greats in the nets. I've been there when he's been watching kids, you know, when he's been hanging around the Lord's nets and he's had access to all that sort of stuff. He's had more advantages than his dad has ever had, right? And he's a bowler. And so you start to realize that there are these incredible things. There's another story that Jimmy Adams told me, which Brian Lara told me was true, which is that when he was a kid, Brian Lara would play this game in the garage, I think it was, or the sort of the indoor outdoor bit of the house where they had a bunch of pot plants and they would throw a ball at each other really fast. And the idea was that you would hit it, and if the ball hit the pot plant, you'd be out. And so Brian Lara and his brother would play this game for hours and hours on end. And Brian Lara became absolutely brilliant at pushing the ball in front of one pot plant and behind the other pot plant, again and again and again and again and again and again, right? But his brother was really good at it too. But we're not talking about his brother. And I was lucky enough when I first moved to the UK to play a lot of, not a lot of cricket, but a bit of cricket with Alistair Cook's brother, Chris.
Okay.
Alistair Cook's brother had this incredible technique, high front elbow, just a proper English cricket technique, lovely flow of the bat, great balance forward, played really straight. I remember being at the non-strikers and always having to duck his dives. Like me and him we both like to go, score quite quickly. So I'd be we'd be counter-attacking and I'd be trying to make sure he didn't hit me with his drives and everything. And
yeah,
he was so more technically correct than his brother, right? But he was playing thirds in London. Oh, way better than Alistair Cook, technically. Right. And he's playing thirds cricket in London. Now, some of it was he was a better cricketer than that. And a bit like me, neither of us really wanted to play too high a level of cricket. And there was but also he wasn't on the verge of playing test cricket or first class cricket, even if he'd gone to the other levels. Right.
Yep.
So again, what's happening here? What is it about these people? What is it about Alistair Cook that makes him want to bat in an ugly way for as long as possible? Basically play two shots over and over again. The pull shot and maybe the clip off his pads. We can let's give him the cut shot as well. Over and over again. For hours on end against the best bowlers in the world. With an angled bat when he defends. All these sorts of things that he shouldn't have, right? And yet he is great and his brother isn't. And I think when we talk about outliers, that there's something about the great batters that, I talk to people like Chris Rogers and Jimmy Adams and heaps of other really good players who that are not great, and they were like, yeah, it's just different. And one of my favorite stories was a guy from Nottingham called Bob Knocker White, who this guy's a proper professional. 50 years he stood on cricket grounds, 10 years as a pro for Middlesex, 10 years as a pro for Nottingham, and then he becomes an umpire for 30 years. And when he's playing for Nottingham, he's batting number 5, number 6. And Garfield Sobers is playing for them. And so they batted together over and over again. And he would go up to Garfield Sobers and be like, tell me how you did that. What are you doing here? What should I be doing better? And Sobers, being a lovely guy, would tell him all these different things. Yeah, I did this and I did that. I did this. And Bob Knocker White would go and practice these things. And every single one of them would fail for him. Right? And I talked to someone about Len Hutton as well. Another guy played with Len Hutton. And I said, I'm not being rude, but you average 32 in first class cricket. And Len Hutton is Len Hutton. And Len Hutton was there helping you. And he was like, yeah, but what Len Hutton was doing, I couldn't do. I tried and I took the lessons I could. So there's something about Garfield Sobers and Len Hutton and Alistair Cook and Brian Lara and Sachin Tendulkar and name them. All these guys that we can't recreate. And we don't know what it is, right? And we're talking about batting. We could be talking about songwriters. We could be talking about chefs. We could be talking about anything. There is something about the people that get to that level of life that we don't know how to make it work for them, right? That there's just something, and it's inbuilt. And it might be one skill that they have that is really elite and that allows them to balance everything else. It might be bunches of little skills, like someone like Jarrod Kimber, who's a fantastic player. He probably has he's probably an 8 out of 10 in a bunch of different things when you look at his batting, right? But he doesn't have a 10 out of 10 skill. And because he doesn't have a 10 out of 10 skill, he doesn't go to the level that maybe someone else can go to. But he's still a fantastic player.
Probably it has to do something with the mindset. In fact, you covered my next two topics on the go. That's brilliant of you. In fact, just a little thought. I used to think as a kid, I always used to see Chandrapal and used to think there must be a technically sounded batter used to look at Chandrapal and used to think, man, this guy has 11,000 runs and I can't score 100 here.
Yeah.
So probably it's about the mindset. But I won't take you much time here. I'll
I
just
was
talk
going to
about
say,
the
I've got to
future of
go
batting.
cover the game in a minute. So last question.
Yeah,
Eddie.
yeah. I have last question for you. So the man who has literally wrote the art of batting, what do you think the batting will look like in 20 years from now?
Yeah, I can't tell you that only because there's going to be so many changes. And so I think that because of the amount of changes that we are going to have, I just don't see how it's possible to be able to say this is definitive. What I would say is this, is that I think premeditated shots are going to get a lot bigger. So we're already seeing premeditated shots in cricket, and I think they will only get bigger because I think players are now understanding that small boundaries, the wind, field positions, all these sorts of things are things they should be exploiting at a level that they never probably always have had been able to do. So I think the future of batting is probably a lot more premeditation, and then maybe with multiple premeditated shots. So was it Ben Duckett in one game tried to play a scoop over the keeper's head and then didn't know what the next shot was, and so he ended up just getting hit on the thigh pad. Whereas I think now you will have a premeditated shot where you go down to scoop, and if it doesn't work, you'll have the instant backup. So not the one now where people are improvising the second shot and going, okay, the ball's here, I'll go with this. But I think what you'll do is be like, okay, I'm going to premeditate this shot. If the bowler sees me, then my backup of this shot is this shot, right? Which is, if you go back and have a look at when players used to run down the wicket to quick bowlers, that's kind of what they used to do back in the 90s, which is be like, I'm going to run down the wicket, and if the ball's not in this position, I'm going to play this shot. And you still see that a little bit now. And I think there might be versions of that. But yeah, I think premeditation is the key. Well, opening up premeditation, the two big things that have been opened up in the last 50 to 60 years is all the parts of the field, which we never used to open up.
Yep.
And the second one is premeditation. Right? Of, I am going to play this shot no matter what the ball is, and I'm going to make it work no matter what the ball is huge. And that has changed things forever.
Thank you so much, sir. It was actually like a Sanchi stupa. You might not know the stupa. It's a place where the Buddha was born. So it felt like enlightening to us. Thank you so much. I can't describe in words. Probably I'm short of English words to describe this feeling. But thank you so much. You came to our podcast. It means the world to us. Thank you so much. I hope we were worthy enough for your presence. And thank
That
you
was
so
great.
much, sir.
Great questions. Thank you very much for having me on.